On the cold pavement outside the city hospital, a tiny figure huddled in the dim glow of the streetlights. Night after night, the same heartbreaking sight. A small, scruffy puppy curled up near the entrance, his frail body trembling against the unforgiving chill. His fur, once golden, was now matted and dull, clinging to his fragile frame as he shivered uncontrollably. His tiny paws, cracked and worn from endless wandering, twitched in his sleep as if chasing something or someone lost to him. Despite the biting wind and the harshness of the night, he never moved from that spot. He didn't beg for food. He didn't bark for attention. He simply waited. His dark, soulful eyes, glistening with an unspoken sadness, remained fixed on the hospital doors, as if expecting someone to walk out and take him home. People passed by, busy doctors rushing to their night shifts, weary visitors leaving with heavy hearts. But no one truly saw him. He was just another stray, another forgotten soul in a city too busy to notice. Yet, there was something about the way he stayed, the way he watched, the way he endured the long, lonely hours, night after night. It was as if he had a purpose, as if he was waiting for someone who would never return. At first, no one paid much attention. The hospital staff, nurses, doctors, and even security guards had seen strays before. The city was full of them, wandering alleys and sleeping in forgotten corners. To them, this little puppy was no different. Some nurses would glance at him as they rushed in and out of the hospital, their tired eyes barely registering the small, shivering figure curled up near the entrance. A few of them even whispered to each other about him. Poor thing. Must be just another stray. He'll probably wander off in a day or two. Someone might take him in, or maybe animal control will come for him. But he never wandered off. He never left. No matter how cold the nights got, no matter how heavy the rain poured, he remained in that same spot, waiting, watching. It was as if the hospital itself was his home, and yet he had no one. Occasionally, a kind-hearted nurse would leave a small piece of bread or scraps from their lunch nearby, hoping he'd eat. Sometimes he did. Other times, he just sniffed at the food and turned away, as if hunger wasn't his greatest pain. Still, they assumed he was just another stray, lost in the chaos of the city, another forgotten creature left to fend for himself. But if they had looked closer, if they had truly seen him, they would have realized something was different about this little dog, because he wasn't just there to survive. He was there for a reason. Nights turned into weeks, yet the little puppy remained. No matter how fierce the wind howled or how heavy the rain poured, he never left. As the temperature dropped, the cold bit at his tiny body, his thin fur offering little protection. His small frame trembled, his paws curled tightly beneath him, but he never moved far. Every night, he would tuck himself against the cold pavement near the entrance, his eyes locked on the hospital doors, as if waiting for someone only he knew. The nurses would watch him from inside, their hearts aching for the small creature outside, but they convinced themselves he'd eventually leave. Most strays did, but not him. Even on the stormiest nights, when the rain soaked his fur and the wind threatened to push him away, he stayed. His tiny body shivered, but his gaze never wavered. It was as if someone, was calling him from inside those walls, and he couldn't bear to walk away. Some hospital workers tried to coax him away, offering food, warmth, shelter. But the moment the doors opened, his tail would lift with a glimmer of hope, only to droop again when he realized the person he was waiting for wasn't there. What was he looking for? Why did he refuse to leave? No one knew. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a stray searching for food. This was a lonely soul, waiting for something, or someone. Dr. Ethan Carter had spent years tending to the sick, his heart devoted to healing. But on one particular evening, as he stepped out of the hospital after a long shift, something unusual caught his eye. The small, scruffy puppy sat near the entrance, just as he had every night before. His tiny body trembled from the cold, but his eyes, deep, longing, and filled with silent sorrow, never left the hospital doors. At first, Dr. Carter dismissed it as just another stray. But the next night, and the night after that, the little pup remained. Rain or shine, he was always there, waiting, watching, hoping. Something about the way the puppy sat, unwavering and determined, pulled at Dr. Carter's heart. He wasn't just lingering, he was searching for something, someone. One night, curiosity got the best of him. As he stepped outside, he crouched down a few feet away from the pup. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice warm and gentle. The puppy's ears perked up slightly, but he didn't move. He only looked at the doctor with those deep, sorrowful eyes, as if pleading for him to understand something. Dr. Carter couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a stray looking for food or shelter. This was a soul in pain. And for some reason, fate had placed him in front of this hospital, night after night. Dr. Carter knew then. He had to find out why. At first, Dr. Ethan Carter thought it was just a coincidence, but as the days passed, he realized it wasn't. Every evening, as he left the hospital, he saw the same small, scruffy puppy curled up near the entrance. His tiny body trembled from the cold, his fur matted and damp from the night air. Yet, no matter how harsh the weather, he never moved far. And every morning, as Dr. Carter returned for his shift, the puppy was still there. The little creature barely slept, his tired eyes blinking away exhaustion as he kept his gaze fixed on the hospital doors. Something about it unsettled the doctor. Stray dogs wandered, searching for food, for shelter, but this one wasn't looking for either. He had a purpose, a reason for staying. Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. The puppy wasn't just lost. He was waiting for something, or someone. And the doctor was determined to find out who. Dr. Ethan Carter had seen his fair share of suffering, patients battling illness, families holding on to hope. But nothing prepared him for the silent sorrow in the puppy's eyes. Every time he passed by, those deep, glistening eyes looked up at him, filled with an unspoken pain. They weren't just the eyes of a stray. They were the eyes of someone who had lost something, or someone. It tugged at his heart in a way he couldn't explain. There was a weight in the puppy's gaze, a story hidden behind his quiet whimpers and shivering frame. He wasn't just begging for food or warmth. He was longing for something far greater. Dr. Carter found himself slowing down whenever he walked by, unable to ignore the pull of that sorrowful stare. It was as if the puppy was pleading with him, not with words, but with the kind of desperation that only a broken heart could understand. And the more the doctor looked into those eyes, the more he knew. He had to find out the truth. After another exhausting shift, Dr. Ethan Carter stepped out of the hospital, the weight of the day still pressing on his shoulders. The cold night air bit at his skin, but his eyes immediately landed on the small figure curled up near the entrance. The puppy was there, just as he had been every night, huddled against the cold pavement, his tiny body trembling. Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment, then sighed. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He walked back inside, grabbed a disposable tray from the cafeteria, and filled it with some leftover chicken and fresh water. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he approached the puppy, he half expected it to run, but the little one barely moved. Instead, those same sad eyes lifted to meet his, filled with both hope and exhaustion. Gently, Dr. Carter placed the food and water down in front of him, then stepped back, giving the puppy space. For a moment, the puppy just stared, as if he didn't quite believe it. Then, cautiously, he leaned forward, sniffing the food before taking small, hesitant bites. It was clear. He was hungry, but he wasn't just starving for food. He was starving for kindness. Dr. Carter crouched nearby, watching in silence. Something about this tiny creature stirred something deep inside him. This wasn't just a lost pup. There was more to this story, and he was determined to find out what it was. At first, the puppy just stared at the food. His tiny body remained still, his ears slightly drooped, as if he didn't trust that kindness could be meant for him. His dark eyes flickered between Dr. Carter and the meal in front of him, uncertainty keeping him frozen in place. Dr. Carter didn't move. He simply watched, his heart aching for the little creature who had spent countless nights alone in the cold. "Go on, buddy," he murmured softly. "It's okay." The puppy sniffed the food, inching forward with caution. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally took a small bite. One bite turned into another, then another. As the warm meal filled his empty belly, something in the puppy changed. His tail, which had been tucked between his legs in fear, gave a small, hesitant wag. It was barely noticeable at first, just the slightest movement. But to Dr. Carter, it spoke volumes. He wasn't just feeding a hungry puppy. He was breaking through a wall of loneliness and fear. For the first time in who knows how long, this little soul wasn't being ignored. He wasn't being shooed away. He was being cared for. And for that, even in his silent way, he was grateful. Dr. Carter lowers himself to the cold pavement, careful not to startle the puppy. His voice is gentle, barely above a whisper, as he asks, "What are you waiting for, little guy?" The puppy pauses mid-bite, lifting his head as if he understands the question. His dark, sorrowful eyes lock onto Dr. Carter's, searching, pleading. He isn't just waiting for food. He isn't just seeking shelter. There's something more, something deeper behind his quiet patience. The night air is crisp, and the faint hum of hospital machinery hums in the background. But at this moment, it feels like the world has shrunk down to just the two of them. Dr. Carter watches as the puppy glances once more toward the hospital doors, his small body shivering, his expression almost hopeful. A strange pang grips Dr. Carter's chest. This puppy isn't just a stray looking for scraps. He's waiting for someone, for something. And suddenly, Dr. Carter knows. This little soul has a story, and it's one he's determined to uncover. As Dr. Carter strokes the puppy's scruffy fur, a voice interrupts the quiet moment. "That little guy's been here for weeks," a deep, gruff tone says. Dr. Carter turns to see the hospital's security guard, Mr. Reynolds, standing with his arms crossed. His uniform is slightly wrinkled, his eyes tired from long shifts. But there's a softness in his expression as he looks down at the puppy. "For weeks?" Dr. Carter echoes, glancing back at the small dog curled up beside him. Mr. Reynolds nods. "Yeah, every night, same spot. Won't budge no matter what. We tried to shoo him away a few times, but he always finds his way back. Poor thing doesn't cause any trouble, just sits there, waiting." Dr. Carter feels a chill, but it's not from the cold. The puppy isn't just wandering. He has a reason for staying, a purpose that keeps him rooted to this spot, outside the hospital doors. He looks into the puppy's eyes once more, the silent plea in them clearer than ever. But what, or who, is he waiting for? Dr. Carter furrows his brow, glancing between the security guard and the small dog huddled at his feet. No one knows where he came from? He asks, his voice laced with curiosity. Mr. Reynolds shakes his head. No collar, no tags. Just showed up one night and never left. We've tried everything, coaxing him with food, calling animal control, even gently leading him away ourselves. But no matter what, he always comes right back. Dr. Carter watches as the puppy curls his tail around himself, his small body shivering in the cold. Despite being given every opportunity to leave, he refuses. He's waiting for someone, Dr. Carter murmurs, more to himself than anyone else. Mr. Reynolds exhales, his breath forming a mist in the chilly night air. Yeah. Question is, who? The thought lingers in Dr. Carter's mind all day. Why would a puppy stay outside a hospital for weeks? Who or what is he waiting for? As the sun sets, casting long shadows over the parking lot, Dr. Carter steps outside, his eyes immediately searching for the small, scruffy figure. And there he is, curled up in the exact same spot, ears perked at every person who walks by, only to lower his head in disappointment. Dr. Carter takes a deep breath. Tonight, he's going to find out the truth. He waits patiently, leaning against the hospital wall, pretending not to watch. Finally, after what feels like forever, the puppy rises, stretching his tiny legs. Then, with a cautious glance around, he trots off into the dimly lit streets. Dr. Carter follows at a distance, his footsteps quiet against the pavement. The puppy moves with purpose, weaving through alleyways, past flickering street lamps, and across empty roads. Where is he going? And what, or who, is waiting at the end of this journey? Dr. Carter keeps his distance, careful not to startle the little creature. The puppy moves with quiet determination, its tiny paws barely making a sound on the cold pavement. After a few turns, the pup slips into a narrow alleyway behind the hospital, dark, silent, and hidden from the bustling streets. Dr. Carter hesitates for a moment before stepping forward, his breath visible in the crisp night air. The alley is littered with discarded boxes, broken wooden crates, and the distant hum of the city. The puppy slows down, sniffing the ground, before carefully approaching a worn-out cardboard box, nestled against the brick wall. Dr. Carter narrows his eyes. There's something inside. He takes a cautious step closer. His heart pounds as he leans in, the dim glow of a streetlight barely illuminating what's before him. Then, in the faint light, he sees it, something that makes his chest tighten. The puppy wasn't just wandering. He was leading him here for a reason. Dr. Carter kneels, his fingers brushing against the tattered blanket. It's thin, barely enough to keep the cold away, yet it's clear that this little spot has been the puppy's refuge for weeks. The fabric is worn, frayed at the edges, carrying the faint scent of something familiar, something human. Beside it, half buried under the folds of fabric, is an old photograph. He picks it up carefully, straightening the curled edges. The image is faded, but the details are unmistakable. A man stands in the picture, smiling warmly. In his arms, he cradles a tiny newborn puppy, the very same one now curled up beside Dr. Carter. A lump forms in the doctor's throat. The pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. This puppy wasn't just a stray. He belonged to someone. Someone who had once loved him. Someone who was now gone. Dr. Carter looks down at the little dog, who watches him with quiet, pleading eyes. What had happened to his owner? Why was he here, alone? One thing is certain. This wasn't just a lost puppy. He was waiting, hoping, and Dr. Carter needed to find out why. Dr. Carter exhales slowly, his breath visible in the cold night air. He looks down at the small, shivering puppy, curled up beside the tattered blanket and faded photograph. His heart clenches. This little dog isn't just wandering the streets without purpose. He isn't just another stray looking for scraps. He's waiting for someone who may never come back. The realization hits him hard, a wave of sorrow washing over him. How long had this puppy been holding on to hope, sitting outside the hospital doors, night after night? How many people had walked past, assuming he was just another abandoned animal, never realizing the depth of his loyalty? Dr. Carter swallows against the tightness in his chest. He glances at the hospital in the distance, the lights glowing softly through the windows. Was the man in the photograph inside? Was he even alive? The puppy lifts his head, ears perked, eyes full of silent longing. Dr. Carter gently strokes his fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're waiting for someone, aren't you?" The puppy doesn't move, doesn't whimper, just stares at him with unwavering devotion. Dr. Carter knows one thing for certain. He can't walk away. Not now. Not after this. Dr. Carter grips the faded photograph tightly, his mind racing. The man in the picture. Who was he? Did he survive? Determined to find answers, he hurries back into the hospital, his heart pounding with urgency. He heads straight for the records department, where a tired-looking nurse raises an eyebrow at his request. "A patient from a critical accident?" she asks, flipping through files. "Do you have a name?" Dr. Carter hesitates, glancing at the worn photograph again. There's no name, no clear details, just a man smiling as he holds a tiny newborn puppy. He takes a deep breath. "I don't, but I think this dog belongs to him. He's been waiting outside every night." The nurse frowns, then sighs. "Let me check." Minutes stretch like hours as she searches through patient records. Dr. Carter's fingers tap anxiously against the counter. Finally, she stops, her expression shifting. "There was a man admitted weeks ago. Severe accident, unconscious for a long time," she murmurs. "No known relatives." Dr. Carter's stomach tightens. Where is he now? She flips another page, then looks up. Room 306. He's still here. Dr. Carter's breath catches. The puppy hadn't been waiting in vain. His owner was inside the hospital this whole time. Dr. Carter's heart sinks. He stares at the nurse, hoping he misheard. "I'm sorry," she says gently, her voice laced with sympathy. "The man didn't make it. He passed away weeks ago." A lump forms in Dr. Carter's throat. He glances at the photo again. The man's warm smile, the tiny puppy cradled in his arms. The little dog had been waiting all this time, for someone who would never come back. The weight of the realization crashes over him. Outside, in the cold night air, that lonely puppy still waited, still hoped. Dr. Carter swallows hard and rubs a hand over his face. How do you explain to an animal that the person they love is never returning? That their devotion, their endless nights of waiting, had been in vain? A deep sadness grips his chest. He knows what he has to do. Outside the hospital doors, the little puppy remained curled up in the same spot, his weary eyes fixed on the entrance. Every time the doors slid open, his ears perked up. His tail gave a hopeful wag, only to droop again when the face he longed for never appeared. He had been waiting in the biting cold, through rain and wind, through endless nights and lonely mornings, waiting for the one person who would never return. Dr. Carter stood there, watching the small creature's unwavering devotion, and felt his heart ache. This wasn't just a stray searching for food. This was a soul searching for love, for a bond that had been broken without warning. The little dog didn't understand loss the way humans did. He only knew that his person had walked into that hospital one day and never walked back out. And so, he waited. Because waiting was all he knew. Dr. Carter's voice was barely above a whisper, yet the weight of his words carried the sorrow he felt deep in his chest. He cradled the trembling puppy in his arms, feeling the frail body shudder against the cold night air. "You've been waiting for someone who won't come back, haven't you?" he murmured, his throat tightening. The puppy didn't resist. Instead, he nestled against Dr. Carter's chest, as if finally allowing himself to be held after weeks of solitude. His small body was cold, his fur damp from the night's dew. Yet in that moment, he seemed to surrender to the warmth, to the kindness, to the understanding that radiated from the man holding him. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. He had spent years saving lives, healing wounds, offering comfort to grieving families. But never had he seen such quiet, unwavering love as this. A love that refused to give up, even when there was nothing left to wait for. As the puppy let out a soft sigh, pressing his tiny head against Dr. Carter's chest, the doctor made a silent promise. This little one had lost someone he loved, but tonight, he wouldn't be alone anymore. Dr. Carter felt a lump rise in his throat as the tiny, shivering puppy lifted its head and gently licked his hand. The warmth of that small gesture, so pure and full of unspoken understanding, sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. Tears welled up in his eyes. He had seen grief in many forms: families mourning lost loved ones, patients clinging to their final moments. But this was different. This was devotion in its purest form. A love so strong that even death couldn't break it. The puppy's eyes, filled with quiet sadness, met his, as if sensing the weight of his sorrow. Dr. Carter let out a shaky breath, his fingers instinctively stroking the scruffy fur. "You miss him, don't you?" he whispered. The puppy gave a soft whimper, curling closer into his arms. A single tear slipped down Dr. Carter's cheek. He had spent his life healing others, but in this moment, it was this tiny creature, broken and alone, who was healing him. Dr. Carter knew there was only one thing he could do. He couldn't bring back the man the puppy had been waiting for, but he could give him something just as important: a new home, a new family. With gentle hands, he cradled the tiny pup against his chest. "You've waited long enough," he murmured. "How about coming home with me?" The puppy blinked up at him, as if trying to understand. Then, as if he finally felt safe, he let out a small, contented sigh and nestled deeper into Dr. Carter's arms. The decision felt right, almost as if it had been fate all along. Dr. Carter had spent years dedicating his life to saving people. Now, for the first time, he was saving a life in a different way. As he walked away from the cold alley, the puppy still held close. Dr. Carter silently promised, "You'll never have to wait alone again." As Dr. Carter carried the tiny pup home, he couldn't stop thinking about everything the little dog had endured. The waiting, the heartbreak, the loyalty. This wasn't just any puppy. He was a symbol of something far greater. "You need a name," Dr. Carter murmured, looking down at the small, scruffy bundle in his arms. The puppy gazed back at him, ears twitching slightly. Then, it came to him. "Hope," he whispered, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Because that's what you've been holding on to all this time." The puppy let out a small whimper, then licked his chin, as if to say he understood. Dr. Carter felt something shift in his heart. This wasn't just about rescuing a stray. It was about second chances, about love loss, and finding a way forward. And as he stepped through his front door, with hope nestled safely in his arms, he knew one thing for sure: neither of them would ever be alone again. From the moment Hope stepped into Dr. Carter's life, everything began to change. The once lonely puppy, who had spent weeks shivering outside the hospital, now had a warm home and a family that adored him. Each morning, Dr. Carter brought Hope along to the hospital, and it didn't take long for the staff to fall in love with him. Nurses stopped to scratch behind his ears, doctors snuck him treats, and even the most serious surgeons couldn't help but smile when he wagged his tail at them. Hope trotted through the hallways like he belonged there, bringing a sense of comfort to everyone he met. Patients awaiting treatment would brighten at the sight of him, and exhausted staff members found solace in his gentle presence after long shifts. One evening, as Dr. Carter watched Hope curled up beside a nurse taking a break, he realized something. This little dog, once abandoned and grieving, had found his purpose. He wasn't just a pet. He was a reminder that even in the hardest moments, love and hope could still find a way in. It started with whispers among the hospital staff. Then, the story of the loyal little puppy waiting outside for weeks began to spread beyond the hospital walls. A nurse shared Hope's journey on social media, and within days, the post went viral. Thousands of people were moved by the heartbreaking yet heartwarming tale of a puppy who had refused to leave his owner's side, even after he was gone. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon, reporters were standing outside the hospital, eager to capture the tale of unwavering loyalty and love. People from all over the community sent letters, donations, and even handmade gifts for Hope, wanting to be part of something so deeply touching. But it wasn't just the public who felt the impact. Patients who had lost hope found inspiration in the little dog's resilience. Families facing difficult times held their loved ones a little closer. And for Dr. Carter, it was a powerful reminder that love, in all its forms, never truly fades. Hope's story had started with loss, but now it was bringing people together in ways no one could have imagined. Hope's unwavering loyalty had touched so many hearts that the hospital staff decided to do something meaningful in his honor. Inspired by his story, they organized a special adoption drive, hoping to give other stray animals a second chance, just like Hope had received. Flyers went up around town, and social media buzzed with excitement. On the day of the event, the hospital courtyard was filled with wagging tails, excited barks, and hopeful eyes. Local shelters brought dozens of dogs and cats, each with their own story of struggle and survival. Families, hospital staff, and even former patients arrived, drawn by Hope's incredible journey. One by one, animals found new homes, some with doctors and nurses who had been touched by Hope's presence, others with families who wanted to bring love into their lives. By the end of the day, countless animals had been adopted, each one beginning a new chapter of love and companionship. Dr. Carter looked down at Hope, who sat proudly by his side, his tail wagging as if he knew. His story had saved more than just himself. He had given others the hope they never knew they needed. As Dr. Carter watches the joyful chaos of the adoption drive, he feels something shift inside him. For years, he had devoted his life to healing people, believing that medicine was his true calling. But standing there, with hope nestled against his leg, he realizes something profound. Saving a life isn't just about medicine. It's about compassion, about seeing the souls that the world overlooks. Hope had been just a small, forgotten puppy on the hospital steps, yet his loyalty, his love, had brought so many together. He hadn't just found a home, he had inspired a movement, Dr. Carter kneels down, gently scratching behind Hope's ears. "You changed everything, little guy," he whispers, his voice filled with gratitude. As the sun sets on the adoption drive, laughter and warmth fill the air. Families leave with new companions, lives forever altered by the simple act of kindness. And in that moment, Dr. Carter knows this was more than just a stray dog's story. It was a reminder that sometimes saving a soul, no matter how small, can make all the difference in the world. That night, for the first time in weeks, Hope doesn't sleep outside in the cold. Instead, he's curled up on a soft, warm couch, his tiny body rising and falling with peaceful breaths. A cozy blanket drapes over him, and a gentle fire crackles in the background, casting a golden glow across the room. Dr. Carter watches from the doorway, a soft smile on his face. Hope stirs slightly, then lets out a contented sigh, as if finally understanding. He's home, no longer waiting, no longer alone, just loved. Hope's ears twitch at the sound of Dr. Carter's voice, and for a brief moment, he lifts his head, his tired eyes filled with trust. The weight of weeks spent waiting in the cold seems to melt away as he nestles deeper into the blanket. Dr. Carter kneels beside him, gently stroking his fur. "You were never meant to wait alone," he whispers again, his voice thick with emotion. Hope lets out a soft sigh, pressing his small body closer as if he finally understands. He's safe, he's home, and he'll never have to wait alone again. Every life matters. Every heart deserves love. If this story touched you, join us in making a difference. Open your heart, lend a helping hand, and remember, sometimes the smallest souls leave the biggest impact. Subscribe for more inspiring stories. Together, we can bring hope, one story at a time.